Welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into Mount Massive Asylum. This is the complete story of Outlast, including Whistleblower. Let's begin. The origins of Mount Massive. In the remote mountains of Lake County, Colorado, there stood a facility that would become the stage for unspeakable horrors. Mount Massive Asylum was originally constructed as a home for the mentally ill, operating until 1971, when it was shut down amid scandal and government secrecy. For decades, the massive building sat abandoned, its halls empty, its secrets buried. In 2009, the asylum reopened under new ownership. The Murkoff Corporation, a transnational company with a long history of disguising profit as charity, acquired the facility through their research and charity branch called Murkoff Psychiatric Systems. The company claimed humanitarian purposes, but the truth was far darker. Mount Massive would become the testing ground for Project Walrider, an experiment so ambitious and so terrible that it would push the boundaries of science and sanity. Deep beneath the asylum, in an underground laboratory hidden from the world, Murkoff scientists built the morphogenic engine. This device was designed based on research that dated back to World War II, the work of a Nazi scientist named Rudolf Wernicke. The theory was simple but horrifying. Intensive dream therapy conducted on traumatized patients could manipulate their lucid dreams, and through this manipulation, they could create something new, something powerful. They would transform the cells in human bodies into factories, producing nanites, microscopic machines that would collectively form a single entity. They called this entity the Walrider. The experiments required subjects, people who had witnessed enough trauma and horror that their minds could properly interface with the morphogenic engine. Murkoff began admitting patients to the asylum, many of them military veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. The company used hypnosis and dream therapy as cover, but the true purpose was far more sinister. These men and women became test subjects, their bodies and minds subjected to procedures that stripped away their humanity. The experiments transformed them into what Murkoff internally referred to as variants, individuals with enhanced strength and pain tolerance, but shattered minds. September 2013, the Whistleblower. Waylon Park was a man who valued his principles. He had graduated cum laude from the University of California at Berkeley, establishing himself as a talented software engineer. He met a woman named Lisa, fell in love, and together they built a life. They had 2 sons, and for a time, everything seemed perfect. Then Murkoff offered him a contract. It was supposed to be simple. 2 weeks of work at Mount Massive Asylum, maintaining the morphogenic engine and its associated systems. The pay was good, and it would only be a short time away from his family in Boulder, Colorado. Waylon accepted, not knowing what he was walking into. From the moment he arrived at Mount Massive, something felt wrong. The security protocols were extreme. He could not call his wife. He could not speak to his sons. The isolation was complete. And as the days passed, Waylon began to see things that troubled him deeply. He witnessed the experiments. He saw what the morphogenic engine did to people. He watched patients being forced into glass spheres, their bodies connected to tubes and instruments, chemicals pumped into their systems while they screamed. He saw the suffering in their eyes, the desperation, the knowledge that they were being used as guinea pigs for something they could not comprehend. Waylon's conscience would not let him remain silent. In the darkness of the server room, hunched over his computer, he composed an email. He documented what he had witnessed, the inhumane experiments, the violations of basic human rights. He sent it to multiple journalists, hoping that someone, anyone, would investigate and expose the truth. Among those who received his anonymous tip was a freelance investigative journalist named Miles Upshur. The date was September 17th, the evening hours ticking toward night. After sending the email, Waylon tried to return to his normal duties, hoping that no one would discover what he had done. But his hope was short-lived. Waylon was called to the underground laboratory to debug a monitoring system. As he worked on the containment capsules near the morphogenic engine, fixing an error code 16, he witnessed something that would haunt him. A man was being dragged toward one of the glass spheres, fighting against the guards who held him. The man was screaming, begging for help. his face pressed against the reinforced glass as he pounded his fists against it. This was Eddie Gluskin, and in that brief moment, Wayland saw the terror in his eyes before Gluskin was forced into the sphere and the experiment began. Wayland had no time to process what he had seen. Jeremy Blair, one of the Murkoff executives supervising the asylum, entered the room with 3 security guards. Blair's face was cold, emotionless. He informed Wayland that they knew about the email. They had been watching him, waiting to see what he would do. Wayland barely had time to react before the guards were upon him. A punch to the face, the butt of a gun against his skull, kicks to his ribs. They beat him until he lost consciousness. When Wayland woke, he found himself strapped to a chair. Approximately 2 hours had passed since his capture. He was no longer in the server room, but in a different section of the underground laboratory. A scientist named Andrew stood over him, preparing him for the morphogenic engine. Wayland struggled against his restraints, but it was useless. Andrew told him that he would become part of the experiment now, another test subject, another body to be used in the pursuit of Project Walrider. The therapy began, and Wayland felt his mind being pulled into strange, terrible dreams. The morphogenic engine manipulated his consciousness, forcing him to experience horrors beyond description. Andrew watched the monitors, taking notes, utterly detached from the suffering he was causing. Then, suddenly, Andrew received a message through his headset. His expression changed from clinical detachment to alarm. He called out that Billy Hope, one of the primary test subjects, had achieved lateral ascension. The Walrider had manifested. What happened next occurred in seconds but felt like an eternity. The lights in the laboratory flickered and died. Emergency lighting cast everything in red. Through the window of the laboratory, Wayland saw movement in the shadows, something that was not quite solid, not quite gas, but somewhere in between. It moved with terrible purpose. A patient in one of the nearby spheres began to scream, and then the screaming stopped. Blood splattered across glass. The Walrider had begun its rampage. In the chaos that followed, alarms blared throughout the facility. The containment had failed. The patients, the variants that Murkoff had created through months and years of torture and experimentation, broke free from their cells. Security forces tried to contain the situation, but they were overwhelmed. The variants had superhuman strength and felt no fear. They killed without hesitation, tearing through guards and staff alike. Bodies fell, blood painted the walls. Mount Massive Asylum descended into hell. Wayland managed to free himself from his restraints during the chaos. A variant, one of the patients who saw him as a fellow prisoner rather than an employee, released him from his cell. Wayland found a camcorder, knowing that he needed to document everything if he was going to survive and expose what Murkoff had done. He began recording the night vision mode, casting everything in eerie green light as he moved through the darkened halls. He made his way through the hospital wing, past cells filled with catatonic patients and others who rocked back and forth, muttering to themselves. He saw things that would have broken a lesser man. Bodies hanging from the ceiling. Patients who had been killed by their fellow inmates. Guards who had been torn apart. The Walrider moved through the shadows, killing anyone it encountered. Its form visible only as a dark cloud that moved with intelligence and malice. Wayland reached a room where several variants stood over a restrained doctor, stabbing him repeatedly while chanting that there were no observers here. They noticed Wayland, but seeing that he was dressed like a patient in his hospital gown, decided to spare him. He was one of them now, a victim of Murkoff, not an enemy. As he exited the room, however, another variant attacked him, hands wrapping around his throat, squeezing. Wayland fought back, managing to break free and run. He navigated through hallways wrapped in plastic sheeting, the material clinging to him as he pushed through. The Walrider appeared before him, and Wayland felt an overwhelming terror unlike anything he had ever experienced. The entity seemed to look at him, to evaluate him, and then it moved past, seeking other prey. Wayland did not understand why it had spared him, but he did not wait to find out. He ran. His path took him to the asylum kitchen, a place that should have been abandoned but was not. Frank Manera was there. a man who had been overweight before his commitment to Mount Massive, but was now something else entirely. The experiments had changed him, not just physically, but mentally. Manera had descended into cannibalism, seeing other humans as nothing more than meat. He wore an apron stained with old blood, and in his hands he held an electric bone saw. Manera spotted Waylon and smiled, a terrible expression that promised suffering. Waylon ran, but Manera followed, the bone saw buzzing as he moved with surprising speed through the kitchen. Waylon saw evidence of Manera's appetite. A corpse stuffed into an industrial microwave. Body parts arranged on counters like ingredients for a meal. A dead security guard was handcuffed to a door handle, left there as decoration or perhaps as a future meal. Waylon managed to unlock a door that led deeper into the facility, but Manera caught up to him just as he reached the exit. The cannibal grabbed Waylon from behind, and for a moment, Waylon thought his throat would be cut. Instead, Manera shoved him toward a furnace, intending to roast him alive. Waylon found himself being pushed through the furnace door, heat washing over him, the smell of ash and burnt material filling his nose. In desperation, he kicked at the back wall of the furnace, and to his shock, the brick gave way. He crawled through the hole he had made, escaping into another section of the building, while Manera howled in frustration behind him. In this new area, Waylon witnessed another horror, a man trapped in an airlock, pounding on the glass as gas filled the chamber. The man's pleas for help were muffled by the thick glass, and Waylon watched, helpless, as the man suffocated and died. Manera was still hunting him, moving through the laboratory spaces with the patience of a predator that knew its prey could not escape forever. Waylon found controls for the airlock and shut off the gas, allowing him to pass through, but it also meant passing by the body of the man who had died there. The hunt continued through the recreation area. It was night outside, the fog thick enough that visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The outdoor space was littered with debris, makeshift shelters, and the bodies of those who had not survived the riot. Waylon saw the twin brother variant here, two men who moved in eerie synchronization, but they did not pursue him. They seemed more interested in discussing the events unfolding around them, speaking in educated tones that contrasted sharply with their naked, blood-covered bodies. Waylon's path was blocked by an electrified fence. He needed to find the generator room to deactivate the power. As he searched the drying ground area, he caught a brief glimpse through a window of a man standing behind a boarded-up door. The man was smiling at him, a knowing grin that sent chills down Waylon's spine. The figure acknowledged Waylon with a slight nod before walking away. This was Eddie Gluskin, the man Waylon had seen being forced into the morphogenic engine earlier that night. Waylon found the generator and switched off the electricity, but almost immediately, a variant turned it back on. He had to make the journey again, this time more carefully, and managed to deactivate it successfully. As he ran through the now unpowered gate, a variant chased him, forcing Waylon to climb a water tower to escape. He leaped from the peak of the tower onto what he thought was a safe landing, an old wooden balcony, but he misjudged the distance and the structure's integrity. The balcony gave way beneath him, and Waylon plummeted through the roof of another building, crashing through wood and debris before landing hard on the floor below. He had fallen into the vocational block, a workshop area that had been converted into something far more sinister. As Waylon picked himself up, pain shooting through his body from the fall, he heard a voice. Dennis was there, a patient with multiple personality disorder whose various personas fought for control. Dennis muttered about a groom downstairs, a man who needed a bride, and Waylon realized, with growing horror, that he had fallen directly into the territory of Eddie Gluskin. Dennis began to stalk Waylon through the vocational block, sometimes speaking in different voices, sometimes seeming helpful, and other times threatening. He made it clear that if he caught Waylon, he would deliver him to the groom as a sacrifice, hoping that this would spare him from the groom's attention. Waylon hid, climbing through the workshop spaces, trying to find a way out, while Dennis searched for him. The night of blood, Miles Upshur arrives. While Waylon fought for survival in the vocational block, another man was just arriving at Mount Massive Asylum. Miles Upshur was an investigative journalist, 20-something years old, with a reputation for pursuing stories that others would not touch. He had been fired from his previous employer for posting material about Afghanistan that the company deemed unacceptable. But this had not stopped him. If anything, it had made him more determined. He became a freelance journalist, and when he received the anonymous email about Mount Massive, he knew he had to investigate. Miles drove through the Colorado mountains in his red 1987 Jeep Wrangler, the date showing September 18th, just after midnight. The facility loomed ahead, massive and dark against the night sky. Cell phone reception had cut off abruptly about a mile from the asylum. Not like a lost signal, but like a jammer. This confirmed Miles's suspicions that Murkoff was hiding something significant here. He parked his Jeep near the main entrance and approached on foot, his camcorder in hand. The main gates were locked, but Miles found an open path along the side of the building. He climbed a scaffold, maneuvering around the perimeter until he found an open window. He pulled himself through, landing in the atrium of the asylum. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Blood, decay, and something else, something chemical and wrong. Bodies were everywhere. Security guards lay in pools of blood, their weapons scattered beside them. Murkoff scientists hung from the ceiling like grotesque decorations, their badges identifying them as part of the Advanced Research Systems Division. Miles began recording, documenting everything he saw. He found notes, documents left behind in the chaos, and began to piece together what had happened here. Project Walrider, the morphogenic engine, human experimentation on a massive scale. A dying security officer from Murkoff's tactical unit grabbed Miles's ankle as he passed. The man was covered in blood, his body broken. He gasped out a warning. The inmates, the variants, had escaped. They were killing everyone. Miles needed to get out, needed to escape before they found him. The main entrance could be unlocked from the security control room. Those were the officer's last words before he died. Miles tried to reach the security room, but the building was a maze, and he kept encountering locked doors. He saw patients moving through the shadows, and they saw him too. Then, suddenly, he was grabbed from behind. A massive hand clamped around his body, lifting him off the ground with frightening ease. Miles came face to face with Chris Walker. Walker was enormous, well over 6 feet tall, and built like a tank. But something was terribly wrong with him. His face was mutilated, the skin of his forehead torn away, his nose and lips removed, leaving a skull-like visage. Walker had done this to himself, ripping away the flesh in a fit of extreme anxiety, believing that it would give him truer vision, like the third eye of a tuatara lizard. He wore the blood-stained remnants of security guard clothing, though it barely fit his massive frame. Walker looked at Miles and spoke 2 words, "Little pig." Then he threw Miles through a window. Miles fell a story, crashing through glass and landing hard on a lower floor. The impact should have killed him, but somehow he survived, though his body screamed in pain. When he opened his eyes, he saw a man standing over him. This was Father Martin, an older patient who wore a makeshift priest outfit fashioned from a straitjacket with a large cross made from belts strapped to his chest. Father Martin's face lit up when he saw the camcorder in Miles's hand. He called Miles an apostle, someone chosen to witness and record the gospel of the Walrider. Martin spoke in calm, reverent tones about the deity that had been born in this place, the God that would soon be set free to cleanse the world. Miles tried to move, but his body was slow to respond. Martin helped him to his feet and then walked away, telling Miles that he must witness everything. Miles made his way to the security control room, passing through the administration block. The building was in chaos. Patients wandered the halls, some catatonic, others aggressive. Miles recorded everything. The bodies, the blood-soaked walls, the messages scrawled in gore. Father Martin had left directions for him, arrows and words written in blood, guiding Miles deeper into the asylum. In the security room, Miles found a working computer. He tried to access the door controls to unlock the main entrance, but the system reported no power. The generator had been shut off. Miles realized he would have to go down to the basement and restart it himself. The basement was dark, forcing him to rely on the night vision mode of his camcorder. The green-tinged view revealed corridors filled with pipes and machinery, and lurking in the darkness was Chris Walker, still hunting him. Walker moved through the basement like a predator, and Miles had to hide, squeezing into lockers and under beds while Walker searched for him. The big man would check hiding spots, open lockers, look under furniture, and Miles had to time his movements perfectly to avoid being caught. Walker would mutter to himself as he hunted, talking about security protocols and the need to contain the wall rider by eliminating all potential hosts. Miles reached the generator and restarted it, the machinery groaning to life, lights flickering back on throughout the building. He made his way back to the security room, but just as he reached the console, Father Martin appeared. The priest moved with surprising speed, grabbing Miles and injecting him with a sedative. Miles felt the world spinning, his vision blurring. Before he lost consciousness, Martin pointed to a security camera feed that showed the underground laboratory. On the screen, Miles saw the Wall Rider, a dark mass of nanites that moved with terrible intelligence, attacking and killing a squad of Murkoff tactical soldiers. Father Martin spoke about accepting the gospel, about all doors opening before him. Then, everything went black. The prison block, twin horrors. Miles woke in a cell. How much time had passed, he could not say. Hours, perhaps. He was in the prison block, a section of the asylum that served as a holding area for the most dangerous patients. The words, "Rest in peace," were written in blood on the wall of his cell. Miles stood, his body aching, his camcorder still strapped to him. Father Martin had left it, wanting Miles to continue documenting the gospel. The prison block was deteriorating, the walls covered in mold and decay, the cells filled with patients in various states of consciousness. Miles moved through the block, finding that many of the cells were open. He encountered the twins, two middle-aged men, naked and covered in blood, who moved with eerie coordination. They spoke to each other in educated tones, discussing whether they should kill Miles and divide his body parts between them. One wanted his liver, the other his tongue. But Father Martin had given them instructions. Miles was not to be harmed, for he was the key to their salvation, the witness who would record the rise of the Wall Rider. The twins respected Martin's wishes, though they made it clear that they were not happy about it. They allowed Miles to pass, watching him with hungry eyes as he moved deeper into the prison block. Miles found his way to the shower room, a place that smelled of mold and something worse. There was a hole in the floor that led to the sewers below. He had no choice but to descend, dropping down into the filthy water below. The sewers were a maze of tunnels, the water waist-deep in some places, filled with debris and refuse. Chris Walker was down here too, stalking through the darkness. Miles had to drain the sewers to proceed, finding controls that would pump out the water. Walker made this difficult, appearing whenever Miles thought he was safe, forcing him to hide and wait for the big man to move on. Once the water was drained, Miles found a ladder that led to the male ward. The male ward was where many of the asylum's patients had lived before the riot. Now it was a charnel house, the rooms filled with bodies and blood. The twins appeared again, moving through the halls, but they did not attack. They were following Father Martin's orders, watching Miles but allowing him to pass. Miles found documents here, patient files and staff reports that detailed the experiments that had been conducted. He learned about the morphogenic engine, about how Murkoff had been testing it on traumatized patients, about how most subjects died or went insane from the therapy, but a few had survived, becoming the variants. As Miles moved through the male ward, he was suddenly grabbed and injected with another sedative. He woke strapped to a wheelchair, being pushed through corridors. His vision was blurry, but he could make out his captor, a thin man with wild eyes and an unsettling smile. This was Richard Traeger, who insisted that Miles call him Doctor, even though he was not one. Traeger wheeled Miles into his personal torture chamber, a room filled with medical equipment and body parts preserved in jars. Traeger spoke to Miles in a friendly, almost jovial tone, calling him Buddy and explaining his philosophy. He talked about how money had evolved from something solid, like the gold standard, to an article of faith. He spoke about turning the consumer into the means of production, a twisted reference to the experiments being conducted. Traeger was highly intelligent, his mind still functioning despite his insanity, and this made him all the more dangerous. Traeger strapped Miles to a table and produced a pair of scissors. He explained that he needed Miles's fingers for his collection. Miles struggled, but the straps held him firmly. Traeger cut off Miles's ring finger and index finger, the pain excruciating. Miles screamed through the gag in his mouth as Traeger hummed cheerfully and placed the severed fingers in a jar. Traeger told Miles that he was tired of licking his own stamps and planned to sell the fingers. He then mentioned that he would soon take Miles's tongue and genitals as well. But Traeger was called away for a moment, leaving Miles alone in the room. Miles, driven by desperation and pain, managed to partially free himself from his restraints. He found a key hanging on the wall and used it to unlock an elevator. As he stumbled toward the elevator, Traeger returned and attacked him. The two struggled, falling into the elevator shaft, and as the elevator began to move, Traeger tried to climb inside, but he was caught between the elevator and one of the floors. His body was crushed, blood and gore splattering everywhere as he died. The elevator stopped, jammed with Traeger's corpse. Miles had to escape through the top of the elevator, climbing up and out. Father Martin's gospel. Miles made his way through the courtyard, an outdoor area surrounded by the asylum buildings. It was night, the fog still thick, and as he moved through the space, he saw the wall rider again. This time, it was closer, moving past him, a mass of shadow and particles that seemed to look at him before continuing on its way. Miles recorded the encounter, his hands shaking as he tried to hold the camcorder steady. He entered the female ward, and here he encountered Father Martin again. The priest stood on an upper floor, shouting down to Miles, telling him how to reach him. Miles had to collect 3 fuses to open the laundry chute, which would give him access to the key that unlocked the stairwell. The female ward was a labyrinth, the rooms filled with evidence of the experiments that had been conducted. Miles saw patient files that described the morphogenic engine in clinical terms, the suffering reduced to data points and statistics. As he made his way through the female ward, Miles encountered more variants, some aggressive, others simply watching him pass. The building was falling apart, sections of floor giving way, walls crumbling. During one jump between platforms, Miles lost his grip on his camcorder, and it fell through a gap, landing in a lower section. He had to descend into complete darkness to retrieve it, navigating by memory and touch until he found the camcorder and turned the night vision back on. With the fuses collected and the key obtained, Miles made his way to the upper floors of the female ward. Father Martin directed him to the chapel in the administration block. Miles returned to the administration block, entering through a different route this time, making his way through the theater and then up to the chapel. What he found there was a nightmare rendered in religious symbolism. Father Martin had arranged for his own crucifixion. He was nailed to a makeshift cross, his followers standing around him, one holding a torch. Martin saw Miles and smiled, asking him to record what would happen next. He spoke about resurrection, about being set free by the wall rider, about the gospel being fulfilled. Then he gave the signal, and the follower lit the pyre at the base of the cross. Flames engulfed Father Martin, and he screamed in agony as he burned alive, his cries echoing through the chapel. Miles recorded it all, his notes reflecting a mixture of horror and dark understanding of what Martin believed. Father Martin had given Miles one final piece of information before his death, a key to the lobby elevator, which he claimed would lead to freedom. Miles took the key and made his way to the elevator. He descended, but instead of reaching the ground floor, the elevator went down, far down, into the underground laboratory beneath the asylum. The underground truth. The underground laboratory was where the morphogenic engine was housed, where Project Walrider had been conducted. Miles stepped out of the elevator into a corridor that led deeper into the facility. The walls here were clean, sterile, a stark contrast to the deteriorating building above. Security doors opened automatically as Miles approached, Father Martin having unlocked them from beyond the grave. Miles found an auditorium where he discovered documents and recordings that explained the origins of Project Walrider. Rudolf Wernick, a Nazi scientist brought to the United States during Operation Paperclip, had developed the theory behind the morphogenic engine. Wernicke believed that intensive dream therapy conducted on traumatized patients could create a connection between their minds and swarms of nanites, microscopic machines that would collectively form a single entity. The project had been part of the MK-Ultra program, the CIA's mind control experiments. But Murkoff had revived it in the pursuit of profit. As Miles moved through the laboratory, Chris Walker appeared again. The big man had followed Miles down here, still fixated on his mission to contain the Walrider by killing all potential hosts. Walker attacked, grabbing Miles, but before he could finish the kill, the Walrider intervened. The entity materialized out of the shadows, its form a swirling mass of nanites that grabbed Walker and lifted him into the air. Miles watched, his camcorder recording, as the Walrider slammed Walker against the walls repeatedly, the big man's screams echoing through the corridor. Then, the Walrider forced Walker's entire body through an air grate, shredding him into pieces. Blood and chunks of flesh were all that remained. Miles continued on, and an elderly voice called to him from a secured office. He found Rudolf Wernicke, ancient and frail, sitting in a wheelchair with a respirator tube connected to his face. Wernicke explained that he was 94 years old and should be dead, but William Hope, the host of the Walrider, believed that Wernicke was his father and had been keeping him alive. Wernicke told Miles that Billy Hope was in a life support pod in the next room, suspended in a chemical bath, his body connected to numerous tubes. The Walrider was manifested through Billy's lucid dreaming, and as long as Billy lived, the Walrider would continue to exist. Wernicke gave Miles instructions. He had to disable the life support system. He had to kill Billy Hope and destroy what Wernicke had created. Miles entered the chamber where Billy was held. The glass sphere containing Billy's body was covered in tubes and cables, the reservoir nearby filled with chemicals that kept him alive. Miles found the controls and shut down the system. The tubes disconnected. The chemical flow stopped. Billy's body convulsed once and then went still, blood pouring from him as he bled out inside the sphere. For a moment, there was silence. Then Miles felt something behind him. He turned, and the Walrider was there, no longer bound to Billy Hope. The entity needed a new host, and Miles was standing right in front of it. The Walrider attacked, and Miles felt the nanites entering his body, billions of microscopic machines fusing with his cells, rewriting him at a molecular level. The pain was indescribable, beyond anything Miles had ever experienced. He fell to his knees, screaming, but there was no one to hear him except Wernicke, who watched through the window with a mixture of scientific fascination and horror. Miles somehow managed to stand. He limped toward the exit, his body no longer entirely his own. The nanites were inside him, and he could feel their presence, their intelligence. He reached the exit door, and it opened. Rudolf Wernicke was there with a squad of Murkoff tactical soldiers, their weapons raised. Wernicke's eyes widened as he realized what had happened. He shouted at the soldiers to shoot, and they opened fire, bullets tearing into Miles's body. But Miles did not fall. The Walrider protected its new host, the nanites sealing wounds as fast as they were made. Miles fell to the ground, seemingly dead, but Wernicke knew better. He backed away, his wheelchair rolling toward the far wall as he realized what he was facing. The soldiers continued firing, emptying their magazines into Miles's body, but it made no difference. Then Miles stood up. The Walrider emerged fully, a dark cloud surrounding him, and he attacked the soldiers. They screamed as the nanites tore them apart, their weapons useless against an enemy that could not be killed by conventional means. Blood painted the walls. Bodies fell. When the killing was done, Miles walked toward the elevator, leaving Wernicke alone with the corpses of his guards. Whether Wernicke survived the encounter or became another victim of the Walrider is unknown, but it seems likely that he died there, in the laboratory where he had created his greatest and most terrible achievement. Wayland's ordeal, Eddie Gluskin. While Miles descended into the underground laboratory and became the Walrider's host, Waylon Park was still fighting for his life in the vocational block. He had been evading Dennis, moving through the workshop spaces, but his path had led him directly into Eddie Gluskin's domain. Eddie Gluskin, known as the Groom, was a man shaped by unspeakable trauma. As a child, he had been sexually abused by his father and uncle, who had photographed their crimes. The abuse had been a matter of medical and public record, and young Eddie had not even understood what was being done to him, only that it hurt. His father and uncle had eventually been incarcerated, but the damage to Eddie's mind was permanent. As he grew, Eddie developed a coping mechanism. He insisted to himself and others that he had been raised in a perfect, idyllic home, a Leave It to Beaver household. But beneath this delusion lurked something dark. Before his commitment to Mount Massive, Eddie had been a serial killer who murdered women, mutilating them in ways that reflected his fractured psyche. He was a misogynist who blamed women for his trauma, even though his abusers had been men. When Murkoff took him as a test subject for the morphogenic engine, Eddie's already damaged mind broke further. He became obsessed with finding the perfect bride, convinced that he could transform male patients into women through surgery and mutilation. He kept the bodies of his victims hanging in the gymnasium like grotesque trophies. Waylon encountered Eddie on the 3rd floor of the vocational block. The Groom appeared suddenly, his face covered in rashes from allergic reactions to the tubes that had been connected to him during his therapy. But he had broken free from his sphere when the Walrider was unleashed. He called to Waylon, addressing him as Darling, and began to pursue him through the building. The hunt was terrifying. Eddie moved with determination, singing "I Want a Girl" in a voice that was both melodious and deeply disturbing. Waylon hid, but Eddie always seemed to know where to look. He taunted Waylon, called him his bride, promised him that they would be together. Waylon found evidence of Eddie's work throughout the vocational block. Bodies mutilated beyond recognition, surgery tables covered in blood, walls decorated with messages about love and marriage written in gore. Eddie eventually caught Waylon and locked him in a locker, pumping gas inside to sedate him. When Waylon woke, 12 hours had passed. He watched through the slits in the locker door as Eddie brought in other patients, strapping them to tables, cutting into them with saws and knives while speaking to them in loving tones. Eddie believed he was creating his perfect bride, and each failure only drove him to try again. Eddie took Waylon out of the locker, stripping him of his clothes and placing him on a surgery table. He positioned Waylon's body so that his genitals were aimed toward a spinning buzzsaw, intending to castrate him and then transform him into a woman. The saw descended, and Waylon closed his eyes, certain that this was the end. But then a variant burst into the room, attacking Eddie. The two fought, and Waylon used this distraction to escape through a broken window, falling and breaking his leg in the process. Waylon now limped as he moved, his injured leg dragging behind him. The pain was excruciating, but he had no choice except to continue. He made his way through the gymnasium, a vast space where Eddie had hung his victims from the ceiling like decorations. Bodies swayed gently in the air, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and agony. Some were recognizable as having once been human, while others had been so thoroughly mutilated that they were merely shapes of flesh and bone. Eddie appeared again, dropping down from the upper levels of the gymnasium. He was furious now, his delusion of finding the perfect bride shattered by Waylon's continued resistance. He chased Waylon through the gymnasium, and Waylon, despite his broken leg, managed to stay ahead. He climbed scaffolding, pulled himself through gaps, squeezed through spaces that Eddie could not follow. The Groom's voice echoed through the gymnasium, sometimes loving, sometimes enraged, always promising that they would be together. Waylon found a door that led to the 2nd floor, but Eddie was close behind. He entered a hallway where the lights flickered, casting everything in intermittent darkness. Eddie walked slowly now, confident that his bride could not escape. Waylon hid in a locker, holding his breath as Eddie passed by, the Groom's fingers trailing along the metal doors as he checked each one. Waylon waited until Eddie had moved past, then slipped out and continued forward. The chase led through workshop spaces filled with machinery and tools. Eddie had set up his surgery stations here, tables covered in blood and surgical instruments. Waylon passed by bodies in various stages of Eddie's work, and each one was a reminder of what awaited him if he was caught. He found an elevator and called it, but it took precious seconds to arrive. And Eddie heard the machinery. The groom came running, and Waylon barely made it into the elevator before Eddie reached him. As the doors closed, Eddie's face was there, inches away, his expression one of heartbroken betrayal. The elevator descended to the basement level. Waylon stepped out into a boiler room, the air thick with steam and heat. He could hear Eddie above him, moving through the building, searching. Waylon limped through the basement, his legs screaming with each step. He found a ladder that led to a higher level, and he climbed, his hands slipping on the rungs, his injured leg barely able to support his weight. He emerged in another section of the vocational block, and here he found a path that led outside. The night air was cold against his bare skin, and Waylon realized he was still wearing only the hospital gown. He moved along a narrow ledge, the building's exterior crumbling beneath his feet. Below him was a drop that would surely kill him if he fell. He pressed himself against the wall and inched forward, his broken leg threatening to give out at any moment. Eddie appeared at a window, seeing Waylon on the ledge. The groom tried to follow, but his larger frame made it difficult. He called to Waylon, his voice now pleading, begging his bride not to leave him. Waylon ignored him and continued forward, finally reaching a window that led back inside to a different section of the building. Inside, Waylon found himself in a storage area. He could no longer hear Eddie, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe that he had escaped. But then he heard singing, faint and distant, Eddie's voice carrying through the walls. The groom was still searching, still hunting, and would not stop until he found his bride or died trying. Waylon moved through the storage area and found a stairwell that led down. He descended carefully, his leg barely functional now, each step a new agony. At the bottom of the stairs, he found a door that opened into a hallway. The walls here were covered in Eddie's writings, promises of love and devotion scrawled in blood and ink. Waylon followed the hallway and found himself back in the gymnasium, having come full circle. But this time, something was different. Eddie was standing in the center of the gymnasium, beneath his hanging victims, and he was not moving. Waylon approached cautiously, using the camcorder's night vision to see in the dim light. As he got closer, he realized that Eddie was dead. The groom had been impaled on a piece of metal scaffolding, his body hanging there like one of his own victims. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, his face still bearing that expression of longing and madness. Waylon did not know what had killed Eddie. Perhaps another variant, perhaps an accident, or perhaps Eddie had done it to himself, finally understanding that he would never find his perfect bride. Waylon did not linger to find out. He found a door near Eddie's body and pushed through it, leaving the vocational block behind. The final escape? Waylon found himself in a corridor that connected to the main asylum building. He could see signs pointing toward the exit, and he allowed himself a moment of hope. But the asylum was not done with him yet. He moved through darkened hallways, his camcorder battery running low, the night vision flickering occasionally. He saw more bodies, more evidence of the carnage that had swept through Mount Massive. Security guards, doctors, patients, all dead, all victims of the riot and the Wall Riders' rampage. He reached the main lobby, the same area where Miles Upshur had first entered hours earlier. The main doors were ahead, locked, but with a control panel nearby. Waylon approached the panel, his hands shaking, and began to work on unlocking the doors. Behind him, he heard movement. He turned and saw variants emerging from the shadows, moving toward him. They did not attack immediately, but they watched him, curious about what he was doing. The doors unlocked with a heavy clunk, and Waylon pushed them open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the smell of pine trees and rain. He stepped outside, leaving the asylum behind, and began to limp down the main path toward the front gate. The variants did not follow. They stood in the doorway, watching him go, as if they understood that he was not their enemy, just another victim of Murkoff's cruelty. But Waylon's escape was not complete. A black helicopter appeared overhead, its spotlight illuminating him. The aircraft descended, landing on the path ahead of him. The door opened. and Jeremy Blair stepped out, the same Murkoff executive who had ordered Whelan's capture and torture. Blair was flanked by 2 tactical soldiers, their weapons ready. Blair approached Whelan with a tablet in his hand. He informed Whelan that he was still under contract with Murkoff, and the non-disclosure agreement he had signed was legally binding. Whelan could not speak about what he had witnessed. The email he had sent to the journalists would be handled, Blair assured him. The story would be buried. Murkoff had too much invested in Mount Massive to allow one whistleblower to ruin everything. Blair then showed Whelan something on the tablet. A photograph of Lisa, Whelan's wife, and their 2 sons. The threat was clear. If Whelan spoke, if he tried to expose Murkoff, his family would suffer the consequences. Blair smiled as he delivered this threat, confident that Whelan would comply. But before Blair could say anything more, something changed in the air. The temperature seemed to drop. The soldiers raised their weapons, sensing danger. Then the wall rider appeared, materializing out of the shadows. It moved past Whelan, ignoring him, and went straight for Blair and the soldiers. The soldiers opened fire, their bullets passing harmlessly through the swarm of nanites. The wall rider grabbed one soldier and lifted him into the air, then slammed him into the ground with such force that his body broke. The second soldier tried to run, but the wall rider caught him, tearing him apart in seconds. Blair screamed and tried to flee back to the helicopter, but the wall rider was faster. Whelan watched as the entity grabbed Blair and lifted him high into the air. For a moment, Blair hung there, suspended 20 feet above the ground, his arms and legs flailing. Then the wall rider threw him down onto the helicopter's rotor blades. Blair's body was shredded instantly, blood spraying across the aircraft and the ground. The helicopter's engine sputtered and died, the blades warped from the impact. The wall rider turned toward Whelan, and for a terrible moment, Whelan thought he would be next. But the entity simply looked at him, the nanites swirling in patterns that almost seemed thoughtful. Then it moved away, returning to the asylum, leaving Whelan alone with the bodies of Blair and his men. Whelan did not wait to see if the wall rider would return. He limped to the helicopter and found it non-operational. But he also found a radio. He used it to send a distress call, giving his location and stating that he needed immediate medical assistance. Then he took Blair's tablet, the one with the photograph of his family, and he sat down on the ground to wait. Emergency services arrived approximately 30 minutes later. Police, ambulances, and fire trucks came up the mountain road, their lights cutting through the fog. Whelan was treated for his injuries, his broken leg set, his body covered in blankets. The officers asked him what had happened, and Whelan told them there had been a riot at the asylum, that people were dead inside, that they needed to send help immediately. The authorities did send teams into Mount Massive, but what they found remains classified. Murkoff had prepared for this possibility. The company's lawyers arrived within hours, claiming jurisdiction over the facility and demanding that all evidence be handed over to them. The local police were overruled by federal agents, and the investigation was taken out of their hands. The bodies were removed. The surviving patients were relocated to other facilities, their memories of the events suppressed through medication and therapy. The morphogenic engine was dismantled, its components destroyed or moved to other Murkoff locations. Mount Massive Asylum was sealed, its doors locked, its windows boarded over. Within weeks, it was as if nothing had happened. But the story was not over. Whelan Park kept the tablet he had taken from Blair, and on it, he found more than just the photograph of his family. There were files, documents, evidence of everything Murkoff had done at Mount Massive. Whelan copied the files and sent them to multiple journalists, including Miles Upsher's colleagues. But Miles was gone. His body was never found in the asylum, and he was listed as missing, presumed dead. The documents Whelan sent did eventually reach the public. Investigative journalists began digging into Murkoff's operations, exposing Project Walrider and the human experimentation that had taken place. But Murkoff was a powerful corporation with connections that reached into the highest levels of government. The company denied everything, claiming the documents were forgeries. They launched defamation lawsuits against anyone who published the information, tying the stories up in court for years. Waylon returned to his family in Boulder. Lisa welcomed him home, but she could see that something had changed in him. He did not speak about what had happened at Mount Massive, not in detail. He told her only that he had witnessed terrible things, that he had barely escaped with his life, and that he needed time to recover. Lisa did not press him for more information. She simply held him and told him that they were together now, and that was all that mattered. The aftermath. What became of the Walrider? The fate of Miles Upshur and the Walrider is shrouded in mystery. Some reports claim that a dark figure was seen leaving Mount Massive Asylum on the night of September 18th, moving through the mountains with inhuman speed. Other reports describe unexplained deaths in the area around the asylum. In the weeks following the riot, bodies found torn apart in ways that defied explanation. Murkoff continued to search for the Walrider, sending teams into the mountains, but they found nothing. The entity had vanished, taking its host with it. Some within Murkoff believed that Miles Upshur was dead, that the Walrider had consumed him and then dispersed back into its component nanites. Others believed that Miles was still alive somewhere, still hosting the entity, still capable of manifesting the swarm whenever he chose. There were theories within Murkoff's Advanced Research Systems division about what the Walrider truly was. Some scientists believed it was simply a weapon, a collection of programmable nanites that could be controlled through the proper interface. Others believed it had developed its own intelligence, that the combination of Billy Hope's consciousness and the nanites' collective processing had created something new, something that was more than the sum of its parts. The morphogenic engine technology was not abandoned. Murkoff had invested too much money and too many years into the project to simply walk away. The company relocated its research to other facilities, places even more remote than Mount Massive, places where the same experiments could continue without the risk of public exposure. They studied the data recovered from Mount Massive, analyzing every detail of Billy Hope's transformation and the Walrider's manifestation. They learned that the key to creating a successful host was not just trauma, but a specific combination of psychological factors. The subject needed to have experienced extreme violence or abuse, needed to have a mind that could enter and maintain lucid dreaming states, and needed to possess a will strong enough to interface with the nanites without losing themselves entirely. Most subjects failed at one or more of these criteria, which is why the morphogenic engine had such a high mortality rate. But Murkoff believed that with refinement, they could perfect the process. They could create controlled Walriders, entities bound to Murkoff's will, that could be deployed as weapons or used for industrial purposes. The applications were limitless, and the profit potential was enormous. The disaster at Mount Massive was seen not as a failure, but as a learning opportunity, a chance to identify and correct the flaws in the system. The patients left behind. Not all the patients at Mount Massive died during the riot. Some survived, hidden in the depths of the asylum, waiting for rescue that would come too late. When Murkoff's cleanup teams arrived, they found these survivors and classified them as contaminated. The patients were not allowed to leave. They were sedated, transported to other facilities, and subjected to memory suppression treatments designed to erase their recollections of Project Walrider. Chris Walker was dead. His body recovered from the underground laboratory in multiple pieces. Dr. Richard Traeger was dead. His corpse removed from the elevator shaft where Miles Upshur had killed him. The twins survived the riot, and they were relocated to a maximum security psychiatric facility in Arizona, where they remain to this day, still speaking to each other in their eerie synchronization, still discussing the events of that night in September. Frank Manera was found in the kitchen area, catatonic and unresponsive. He was transferred to a different facility, where he remains under heavy sedation. The doctors there have determined that whatever the morphogenic engine did to his mind cannot be undone. He will spend the rest of his life in a chemical haze, unable to harm anyone, but also unable to recover. Father Martin's body was recovered from the chapel, burned beyond recognition, but identifiable through dental records. His followers, the patients who had believed in his gospel, were scattered across multiple facilities. Some of them continued to speak about the Walrider as if it were a deity, claiming that it would return to free them. Others fell silent, retreating into their own minds, refusing to acknowledge that anything unusual had happened at Mount Massive. Dennis, the patient with multiple personality disorder who had stalked Wayland Park through the vocational block, was found dead in the gymnasium. The cause of death was unclear, but it appeared he had been killed by another patient, possibly Eddie Gluskin, before Gluskin's own death. Dennis's body was removed and cremated, his ashes scattered without ceremony. Eddie Gluskin's body was recovered from the gymnasium, still impaled on the scaffolding where he had died. The autopsy revealed that he had indeed been killed by the metal structure. But whether he had fallen onto it accidentally or had impaled himself deliberately could not be determined. His body was cremated, and his ashes were disposed of in an unmarked location. No family members claimed him, and no one mourned his passing. Billy Hope's body was recovered from the underground laboratory, still inside the life support pod where Miles Upshur had killed him. Murkoff scientists examined the body extensively, trying to understand exactly how Billy had interfaced with the Walrider. They found that his brain had been physically altered by the morphogenic engine, that new neural pathways had formed, creating connections that should not have been possible. But with Billy dead, they could not study these changes in real time, and much of what they hoped to learn was lost. Rudolf Wernicke's body was also found in the underground laboratory, slumped in his wheelchair, his respirator disconnected. The official report stated that he had died of natural causes, but those who saw the body knew better. Wernicke's face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. Whatever had happened in those final moments before his death had frightened him beyond measure, and he had died knowing that his creation had escaped his control, the records destroyed. Murkoff worked quickly to erase all evidence of Project Walrider. Computer systems were wiped, servers destroyed, documents shredded. The company claimed that the asylum had been the site of a patient riot, nothing more, and that the deaths had been tragic but not unexpected, given the nature of the facility. They pointed to Mount Massive's history, to the scandals that had led to its closure in 1971, suggesting that the building itself was somehow cursed or that the patients had been affected by environmental factors. The families of the staff who died at Mount Massive were paid substantial settlements in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. They were told that their loved ones had died heroically, trying to contain the riot and protect the patients. Memorial services were held, and Murkoff representatives attended, offering condolences and speaking about the important work that had been done at the facility. The families of the patients who died received similar treatment, though the settlements were smaller. Murkoff claimed that the patients had been receiving experimental treatments for their conditions, treatments that had shown promise, and that their deaths were a tragedy, but also a sacrifice that would lead to breakthroughs in psychiatric medicine. Most families accepted the settlements too grief-stricken or too intimidated to ask questions. But some families did not accept Murkoff's explanations. They hired lawyers, demanded investigations, pushed for answers. Murkoff responded with overwhelming legal force, filing countersuits, obtaining restraining orders, and using its connections to ensure that no official investigations were conducted. The families found themselves fighting a corporation with unlimited resources, and one by one, they gave up, defeated by the legal system and exhausted by their grief. The journalists who received Wayland Park's documents tried to publish them, but they faced similar obstacles. Editors were pressured by their publishers not to run the stories. Lawyers for Murkoff threatened lawsuits for defamation. Sources suddenly became unavailable, refusing to speak on the record. The few articles that were published were buried in the back pages of newspapers and on obscure websites, reaching only a small audience that was already skeptical of conspiracy theories. Miles Upshur's colleagues tried to follow up on the story, hoping that their missing friend's sacrifice would not be in vain. But without Miles's direct testimony and without his recordings, which had been lost when he became the Walrider's host, they had little to work with. The email that Wayland had sent had been encrypted and routed through multiple servers, making it difficult to verify its authenticity. Murkoff's lawyers successfully argued in court that the documents were forgeries, and the case was dismissed. Wayland's silent burden. Wayland Park tried to return to a normal life, but he found it impossible. He could not sleep without seeing Eddie Gluskin's face, without hearing Frank Monera's bone saw, without feeling the terror of being strapped to that surgery table. He developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks and panic attacks. Lisa tried to help him, but she did not fully understand what he had been through, and Waylon could not bring himself to tell her all the details. He saw therapists, took medication, tried various treatments, but nothing truly helped. The memories remained vivid and inescapable. He would wake in the middle of the night, screaming, convinced that he was back in Mount Massive, that Eddie was coming for him, that the Wall Rider was hunting him through the dark corridors. His relationship with his sons suffered. They were young, too young to understand why their father had changed, why he no longer played with them the way he used to, why he sometimes looked at them with such sadness in his eyes. Waylon tried to be a good father, tried to be present for them, but the asylum had taken something from him that he could never get back. Lisa remained patient, remained supportive, but even she had limits. There were arguments, moments when the stress became too much, when Waylon's inability to move past his trauma created friction in their marriage. They considered separation, thought about what might be best for the boys, but ultimately decided to stay together. Lisa loved Waylon, and she believed that with time, he would heal. Years passed, and Waylon did find ways to cope. He threw himself into his work, taking on projects that kept his mind occupied. He avoided news stories about Murkoff, refused to speak about Mount Massive, and tried to convince himself that the chapter of his life was closed. But he never truly forgot. He never forgave Murkoff for what they had done to him and to all the other victims of Project Wall Rider. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and his family was asleep, Waylon would take out the tablet he had stolen from Jeremy Blair. He would look at the files, the evidence of Murkoff's crimes, and he would wonder if he had done enough. He had sent the documents to journalists. He had tried to expose the truth, but Murkoff was still operating, still conducting experiments, still hurting people in the name of profit and progress. Waylon knew that there were other facilities, other projects, other victims who needed someone to speak for them. But he also knew that he had his own family to protect, his own life to live. He could not spend the rest of his days fighting Murkoff. He had to find a way to move forward, to let go of the past, even though the past refused to let go of him. Miles Upsher's fate. What truly happened to Miles Upsher after he became the Wall Rider's host remains one of the great mysteries of the Mount Massive incident. The official story, as told by Murkoff, is that Miles died in the asylum during the riot, that his body was lost in the chaos and likely destroyed by fire or other means. His name was added to the list of casualties, and his family was notified of his death. But those within Murkoff who knew the truth understood that Miles had not died, at least not in any conventional sense. He had been transformed, merged with the Wall Rider, and had become something that was neither fully human nor fully machine. The entity that walked out of Mount Massive that night was Miles Upsher and the Wall Rider, simultaneously two consciousnesses sharing one body, or perhaps one consciousness inhabiting two forms. There were sightings in the months following the incident. Hikers in the Colorado mountains reported seeing a figure moving through the trees at impossible speeds, a man who seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Campers spoke of hearing screams in the night, followed by silence so complete that even the insects stopped chirping. Local law enforcement investigated several deaths in the area. Bodies found torn apart in ways that suggested an animal attack, but no animal tracks were ever found. Murkoff sent teams to search for Miles, hoping to recapture him and study him. They believed that if they could bring him back, they could understand how he had achieved stable symbiosis with the Wall Rider, something that Billy Hope had never fully accomplished. But every team that went looking for Miles either found nothing or did not return. Those teams that did come back reported strange phenomena, equipment malfunctions, unexplained power losses, and the feeling of being watched by something that remained just out of sight. Some within Murkoff theorized that Miles had retained his human consciousness and was actively hunting them, that he remembered what had been done to him and was seeking revenge. Others believed that the Wall Rider had consumed Miles's mind entirely, that what remained was simply a predatory entity without conscience or morality, killing anyone who entered its territory. There is a third possibility, one that few at Murkoff considered, but that makes a certain terrible sense. Perhaps Miles and the Walrider had achieved true symbiosis, merging into something new, an entity that possessed human intelligence and empathy combined with the Walrider's power. If this were true, then Miles would be capable of making choices, of deciding who lived and who died, of choosing when to manifest the swarm and when to remain hidden. If Miles Upshur truly still exists somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, then he is both a man and a god, capable of terrible destruction, but also capable of restraint. He would know what Murkoff did at Mount Massive. He would remember every patient who suffered, every life that was destroyed. And he would be waiting, patient and immortal, for the day when he could make Murkoff pay for its crimes. The legacy of Mount Massive. Mount Massive Asylum stands empty now, its doors chained, its windows dark. The building is slowly being reclaimed by nature, vines growing up its walls, trees pushing through cracked foundations. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to approach the fence to see how close they can get before fear drives them back. Urban explorers occasionally break in, hoping to find evidence of what really happened there. But most leave quickly, disturbed by the atmosphere, by the sense that they are not welcome, that something still lingers in those halls. The building is scheduled for demolition, Murkoff having finally decided that maintaining the facade of an abandoned asylum is more trouble than it is worth. But the demolition has been delayed repeatedly, workers refusing to enter the building, contractors backing out of agreements, equipment malfunctioning in ways that cannot be easily explained. It is as if the asylum itself resists destruction, as if something within its walls wants it preserved as a monument to what happened there. The families of the victims have never received full answers. They know their loved ones died at Mount Massive, but they do not know the full extent of what those loved ones endured. They do not know about the morphogenic engine, about the Walrider, about Project Walrider and Murkoff's ambitions. They have been given sanitized versions of events, told that their family members died quickly and painlessly, which is a lie. The truth is too horrible for Murkoff to admit, too damaging to the company's reputation. Wayland Park remains the only survivor who knows the complete story, and he has chosen silence, not out of loyalty to Murkoff, but out of fear for his family and out of exhaustion from fighting a battle he cannot win. He has the documents, the evidence, but he has learned that evidence alone is not enough when facing an opponent as powerful as Murkoff. The company has lawyers, money, connections, and a complete lack of conscience. They will destroy anyone who threatens them, and they will do so without hesitation. But the story of Mount Massive has not been completely buried. There are whispers, rumors, theories shared on internet forums and in conspiracy circles. Some of these theories are wildly inaccurate, mixing truth with fiction in ways that make the real story seem even more unbelievable. But others are surprisingly accurate, based on leaked documents and testimony from people who knew victims or who worked for Murkoff in non-classified roles. These stories keep the memory of Mount Massive alive. They ensure that the patients who died there are not forgotten, that their suffering was not completely in vain. They serve as a warning about what can happen when profit is prioritized over ethics, when corporations are allowed to operate without oversight, when human lives are treated as expendable in the pursuit of scientific advancement. The continuing threat, Murkoff Corporation continues to operate its stock price unaffected by the Mount Massive incident. The company has diversified its holdings, investing in pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and biotechnology. To the outside world, Murkoff appears to be a respectable corporation, one that funds charities and supports medical research. But beneath this facade, the company's true nature remains unchanged. Project Walrider has not been abandoned. The research continues in other facilities, in places even more remote and secure than Mount Massive. Murkoff has learned from its mistakes, implementing better security protocols, stricter containment procedures, and more thorough screening of employees to prevent another whistleblower from exposing their work. The company is determined to create a stable, controllable Walrider, believing that such an entity would have countless applications. Military forces would pay billions for a weapon that could infiltrate enemy territory undetected, that could kill without leaving evidence, that was immune to conventional defenses. Industrial applications might include using the nanites for microscopic construction or for medical procedures that current technology cannot perform. But Murkoff has not learned the most important lesson from Mount Massive, that some things should not be created, that some lines should not be crossed, that the pursuit of profit and power can lead to consequences that cannot be controlled or predicted. The Wall Rider is not simply a tool or a weapon. It is an entity with its own intelligence, its own will, and potentially its own agenda. Creating it was an act of hubris, and what happened at Mount Massive was the universe's response to that hubris. Somewhere in the Colorado mountains, something waits. It might be Miles Upshur, still alive after all these years, still hosting the Wall Rider, still watching Murkoff's facilities and waiting for the right moment to strike. Or it might be something else. A remnant of Billy Hope's consciousness merged with the nanites, an echo of all the suffering that occurred at Mount Massive, a vengeful spirit made manifest through science rather than superstition. Whatever it is, it has not forgotten. It remembers every experiment, every scream, every life taken in the name of progress. And when the time comes, it will return to remind Murkoff and the world that there are some sins that cannot be buried, some crimes that cannot be covered up, and some prices that must eventually be paid. Epilogue, years later. 5 years have passed since the night of September 18th. Wayland Park is still alive, still living in Boulder with Lisa and his sons. His boys are older now, entering their teenage years, and they have largely forgotten the time when their father disappeared for 2 weeks and came back changed. Life has moved on, as it always does, and the Park family has found a new normal. Lisa knows more now than she did in the beginning. Wayland finally told her some of what happened at Mount Massive. Not all the details, but enough that she understands why he wakes screaming in the night, why he cannot watch certain movies or read certain news stories. She holds him when the memories become too much, and she reminds him that he survived, that he is home, that he is safe. But Wayland knows he will never truly be safe. Not as long as Murkoff exists, not as long as the company continues its experiments. He has heard rumors of new facilities, new projects, new victims. He has considered reaching out to journalists again, trying one more time to expose the truth, but each time he decides against it. He has already sacrificed enough. He has already given more than most people would ever give. It is time for someone else to take up the fight. Miles Upshur's colleagues continue to investigate Murkoff, driven by loyalty to their missing friend and by a belief that the truth matters. They have published articles, given interviews, and appeared on podcasts, but their impact has been limited. Murkoff is too powerful, too well-connected, and too ruthless. The journalists have faced harassment, legal threats, and professional consequences for their persistence. Some have given up. Others continue, knowing that they may never win, but unable to stop trying. Mount Massive Asylum still stands, though its demolition is scheduled for next spring. The demolition crew has been hired, the permits have been obtained, and the work will begin in April. The building will be razed to the ground, its rubble buried, and the land will be sold to a developer who plans to build luxury homes on the site. Soon, families will live where patients once suffered, children will play where horrors once occurred, and the physical evidence of Murkoff's crimes will be erased from the landscape. But the memory will remain. The victims will be remembered by those who love them. The survivors will carry their scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in the darkness, whether in the mountains of Colorado or in the depths of Murkoff's other facilities, the Wall Rider waits, patient and eternal, a reminder that some things cannot be destroyed, some forces cannot be controlled, and some truths will eventually come to light, no matter how deeply they are buried. The story of Mount Massive Asylum is over, but the story of Murkoff Corporation continues. The company thrives, its profits grow, and its experiments proceed behind closed doors. The world does not know what Murkoff has done, what it continues to do, and what it plans to do in the future. But perhaps one day, the truth will emerge. Perhaps one day, someone will succeed where Wayland Park and Miles Upshur could not. Perhaps one day, Murkoff will face justice for its crimes. Until that day comes, the legacy of Mount Massive serves as a warning and a reminder that the greatest horrors are not supernatural, but human, born from greed and ambition and a willingness to sacrifice others for personal gain. The monsters in this story were not the patients who became variants, not the Walrider, and not even the individuals like Eddie Gluskin or Chris Walker whose minds had been broken by trauma and torture. The true monsters were the men in suits who signed off on the experiments, the scientists who conducted them, and the corporation that funded it all in the pursuit of profit. This is the complete story of Outlast, a tale of suffering and survival, of corporate evil and human resilience, of science pushed beyond ethical boundaries and the terrible consequences that followed. It is a story that should never have happened, but it did. And now all that remains is to remember the victims, honor the survivors, and hope that such horrors will never be repeated. But deep down, those who know the truth understand that hope may not be enough. Murkoff continues, the experiments continue, and in the darkness, something watches and waits, remembering everything, forgetting nothing, and biding its time until the moment comes to remind the world that every debt must eventually be paid, and every sin must eventually be answered for. The asylum is empty, the patients are gone, but the horror lives on, waiting in the shadows, patient and immortal, ready to emerge again when called upon or when the world least expects it. This is not an ending, but a pause, a breath taken before the next scream, the next revelation, the next terrible chapter in a story that refuses to end. And so we close this chronicle of Mount Massive Asylum, of Project Walrider, of the night when September 18th became a dividing line between the world as it was and the world as it would become. We remember the dead, the patients who were used as test subjects, the staff who tried to stop the horror or who enabled it, and the innocent people whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We remember the survivors, Wayland Park, who escaped with his life but not his peace of mind, and Miles Upshur, who may or may not still exist somewhere in the form he once held. Most of all, we remember that this story is not unique. Mount Massive was one facility, one project, one corporation's crime. But in the world beyond these mountains, similar horrors occur every day, hidden behind non-disclosure agreements and security fences, justified by profit margins and the promise of progress. The story of Outlast is a warning about what happens when we stop asking questions, when we accept secrecy as necessary, when we allow power to operate without accountability. The lights in Mount Massive Asylum have gone out, the machines have stopped running, the screams have faded into silence, but the lessons remain, waiting to be learned by those willing to look beyond the surface, to question the official stories, to demand truth even when truth is uncomfortable. This is where the story ends, in the quiet darkness of an abandoned building, with questions unanswered and mysteries unsolved. But somewhere out there, in facilities we do not know about, in projects we have not yet discovered, the same patterns repeat, the same mistakes are made, and the same terrible consequences wait to unfold. The story of Outlast is complete, but the story of human ambition, corporate greed, and the cost of progress continues. An endless cycle that will only be broken when we choose to break it, when we decide that some knowledge is not worth the price it demands, and some profits are stained with too much blood to ever be made clean. And that's where the story of Mount Massive comes to an end. What happened inside those walls was never meant to be seen. It was hidden behind locked doors, false reports, and silence. But silence never lasts forever. Miles Upshur came looking for the truth. Wayland Park risked everything to let the world know what Murkoff was doing. Two different people, one nightmare, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Thank you for being here and listening to this story with me. If you enjoy calm, story-focused videos like this, feel free to stay around and explore the channel. There are many more dark worlds and forgotten stories waiting to be told. I'll see you in the next one.